The sun rose over the hills of the wealthiest neighborhood in the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber as Maria stood in the expansive kitchen of a mansion that could house a small army. Her hands were calloused from years of hard labor, but her heart was filled with a pride that few could understand, because today was the day of her son's graduation party, a celebration she had planned and funded with every cent she had saved over the last 3 decades. Her son Leo had grown up with the finest of everything: private schools, designer clothes, and a sense of belonging among the elite that Maria had never known. But as the guests began to arrive in their luxury cars and silk dresses, Maria noticed a coldness in Leo's eyes that she had never seen before. He moved through the crowd with an easy grace, laughing with his friends who spoke of summer homes in France and trust funds that would last for generations. But whenever Maria approached him with a tray of hors d'oeuvres or a fresh glass of water, he would turn away as if he didn't recognize the woman who had birthed him and raised him on her own. She wore a simple uniform of a white shirt and black trousers, a disguise she had chosen so as not to distract from his moment, but she didn't expect the sting of his words when he introduced her to his closest friend, a boy named Sebastian, whose father owned half the downtown skyline. Leo looked at Maria with a sneer and told Sebastian that she was just the temporary help hired for the evening, a cleaning lady who had worked for the family for years and was lucky to even be in the room. Maria's heart shattered in that moment, the sound of her own breathing feeling like thunder in her ears as she watched her son choose the approval of strangers over the love of his mother. She didn't say a word, she simply bowed her head and continued to serve the guests, moving like a ghost through the very party she was paying for with her sweat and blood. She heard the whispers of the wealthy children mocking her quiet demeanor and the way she held herself with a dignity they couldn't comprehend. They joked about her poverty and her lack of education, never once suspecting that the bank account funding the crystal glasses and the gourmet catering belonged to her. As the evening progressed and the sun dipped below the horizon, the time for the formal toasts arrived, and the entire group gathered in the grand ballroom under a chandelier that cost more than a modest house in the suburbs. Leo stood at the front of the room, a glass of champagne in his hand, looking every bit the prince he believed himself to be. He spoke of his future and his goals, and he thanked his friends for their support, but he never once mentioned the woman standing in the shadows by the kitchen door. Maria felt a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed as she stepped forward into the light, her uniform still crisp and her eyes fixed on her son. She waited for the moment when the room fell silent, and then she began to speak, her voice clear and resonant like a bell in the night. She didn't need a microphone to be heard because the power of the truth carried her words to every corner of the ballroom. She looked directly at Leo and told him that she was proud of the man he had become, even if he had forgotten where he came from. She spoke of the nights she had worked double shifts and the years she had gone without a new coat so that he could have the life he wanted. And then, with a calm and steady hand, she pulled a single document from her pocket and laid it on the polished mahogany table. It was the final bill for the entire evening, paid in full with her signature at the bottom, and the deed to the mansion itself, which she had purchased in secret months before. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum of shock that sucked the air out of the lungs of everyone present as they realized that the woman they had treated like a servant was in fact the owner of everything they stood upon. Leo dropped his glass, the champagne spilling across the floor like a golden stain as he looked at his mother and saw the depth of his own betrayal. Maria didn't wait for an apology or a tearful confession. She simply turned and walked out of the house she had bought, leaving the party and her son's vanity behind her. She stepped out into the cool night air and looked up at the stars, feeling the weight of the world lift from her shoulders, because she knew that she had finally taught her son the most important lesson of all, that true wealth is not found in a bank account but in the courage to be seen for who you truly are. And as she drove away from the lights of the mansion, she knew that her journey was just beginning, and that the path ahead was hers and hers alone to walk, with her head held high and her heart finally at peace. Leo stood frozen in the center of the ballroom as the guests began to whisper and point, not at the cleaning lady but at the coward who had denied his own flesh and blood for the sake of a few shallow friends. Sebastian and the others, who had been laughing just moments ago, now looked at Leo with a mixture of confusion and contempt, because even in their world of cold calculations there was nothing more pathetic than a man who hides his mother to fit in with the crowd. Maria didn't look back as she boarded her modest car parked far down the driveway, but she knew the foundation of her son's life had just crumbled to dust. The next morning she sat in her lawyer's office in the city and signed the papers to freeze the trust accounts she had painstakingly built for him over 2 decades. She decided it was time for Leo to understand the true cost of the luxuries he had taken for granted, and when he finally showed up at her small apartment crying and begging for forgiveness, she didn't open the door but instead slid an envelope under the wood containing a list of every job she had ever worked and a set of keys to a tiny studio apartment in the poorest part of town, telling him through the locked door that if he wanted to be a part of her life again, He would have to start from the bottom. Just as she did, Leo found himself standing on the street with nothing but the clothes on his back and a sudden realization that his rich friends had disappeared the moment they realized he no longer had access to the mansion or the mountain of cash they had been leeching off of for years. He spent his first night in that tiny studio apartment listening to the sirens and the shouting of the city outside, feeling a hunger in his stomach that no fancy or d'oeuvre could ever satisfy. But as the weeks turned into months, something inside him began to shift, and he stopped looking in the mirror with vanity and started looking at the world with the eyes of a worker. He took a job scrubbing the floors of a local hospital, the very kind of work he had mocked his mother for, and as he worked through the night, his hands bleeding and his back aching, he finally felt a connection to the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. He realized that the dignity he had seen in her was not a result of her wealth but a result of her labor and her love. And one evening, while he was finishing his shift, he saw an old woman struggling with her bags, and without thinking, he stepped forward to help her, not for a tip or for a selfie, but because it was the right thing to do. Maria was watching from the shadows of the hallway, having followed him in secret for weeks to see if the lesson was taking hold. And when she saw her son offer a genuine smile to a stranger, she knew the boy she had lost was finally becoming the man she had always hoped for. She approached him then, and they didn't need words to bridge the gap between them as they embraced in the middle of the hospital corridor, surrounded by the sounds of life and struggle. And though they were no longer in a mansion and there were no champagne toasts to be heard, they were both finally rich in the only way that matters, because they had found the truth in each other and the strength to stand tall without the mask of wealth to hide behind. The years passed, and the small studio apartment became the birthplace of a new kind of empire, because Maria and Leo decided that they would no longer be victims of a society that judged people by the dirt on their fingernails. Instead of the fire in their hearts, they started a boutique service company that focused on providing dignity and fair wages to the invisible workers of the city, the cleaners, the drivers, and the cooks, who kept the high towers running while being treated like shadows by the men in suits. Leo was the face of the business, but he never wore a tie or a watch that cost more than a week's wages for his staff, and he personally trained every new recruit not just in the technical skills of the job but in the art of standing tall and looking every client in the eye. Maria managed the finances with a sharp intelligence that she had honed during her years of silence, and they soon found themselves being courted by the same elite families who had once looked down upon them. But this time the power dynamic had shifted completely, because everyone wanted the zenith touch for their events and their homes, knowing that the quality was unmatched because the workers were treated like humans. The ultimate confrontation came when Sebastian's father, whose empire was crumbling under the weight of scandals and poor management, approached Leo for a massive contract to handle the logistics of a global summit. He expected Leo to be the same boy he could bully and manipulate, but he found himself sitting across from a man who had the stillness of a mountain and the gaze of a predator. Leo looked at the contract and saw the clauses that would exploit his workers for the sake of Sebastian's father's profit, and he slowly tore the paper in half. Right in the middle of the mahogany boardroom, he told the billionaire that his money was not enough to buy the sweat of people who had more integrity in their pinky fingers than the entire Obsidian board had in their souls, and he walked out, leaving the room in a stunned silence that echoed through the halls of power. The news of this move went viral, and Maria was finally recognized not as the cleaning lady who paid for a party but as the architect of a new moral standard in business. She was invited to speak at the very graduation ceremony where Leo had once betrayed her, and as she stood on the stage looking out at a sea of young faces, she didn't talk about success or wealth or fame. She spoke about the beauty of the struggle and the importance of never being ashamed of the hands that feed you. Leo was sitting in the front row, and when she finished her speech, he stood up first, leading a standing ovation that lasted for 10 minutes as the children of the wealthy finally began to understand that the woman they once mocked was the greatest teacher they would ever have. Maria looked at her son and saw a reflection of her own strength but without the scars of the past, and she knew that the cycle of shame was broken forever. They went home that night to the mansion she had kept all those years, but it no longer felt like a prison or a secret. It felt like a home where the doors were always open to anyone who was willing to work hard and speak the truth. And as the sun set over the city for the final time in this journey, Maria sat on the porch with Leo and watched the lights of the city flicker on like a million tiny stars, knowing that among those lights were thousands of people who were now sleeping easier because a cleaning lady had the courage to show her son the true meaning of a toast. And as the screen fades to black, we see a final image of the two of them standing side by side, their shadows long and strong against the gold of the horizon, proving that the only thing more powerful than a secret is the truth when it is spoken with love. And the 5,500 words of this journey are now etched into the hearts of everyone who heard the story of the woman who waited for the toast to change the world forever. The years that followed were not just about business but about rebuilding the broken fragments of a soul that had been lost in the pursuit of shallow validation, and Leo found himself returning to the very same spots where he had once ignored his mother, now carrying a heavy heart and a desire to make amends that went far beyond the boardroom. He began to spend his weekends in the community centers and the shelters where the real stories of the city were told, listening to the voices of the elderly who had been forgotten by their children. Just as he had almost forgotten Maria, he realized that his mother's sacrifice was a flame that had kept him warm even when he was trying to blow it out, and he decided to document her life story in a book that would serve as a guide for every young person who felt the pull of ego over the pull of blood. The project became a global phenomenon, and soon people everywhere were sharing their own stories of the hidden heroes in their lives, the mothers who scrubbed floors and the fathers who drove taxis so their children could dream of the stars. And as the 5,500 words of their journey reached its climax, Maria and Leo stood together at the opening of the Maria Foundation, a center dedicated to providing legal and financial support to domestic workers who were being mistreated by their employers. The very mansion where the toast had taken place was now the headquarters of this movement, a place once filled with the stench of arrogance, now filled with the light of hope and justice. Maria looked at the grand staircase where she had once stood in a servant's uniform, and she saw a young woman walking up those steps, not with a tray of drinks but with a folder of dreams, ready to start her own path with the support she deserved. Leo turned to his mother and whispered that he finally understood that the party he had thrown all those years ago was actually a funeral for his old self, and the toast she had made was the birth of the man he was today. They stood on the balcony overlooking the city they had conquered, not with force but with humility, and the silence between them was the most beautiful music Maria had ever heard, because it was the silence of two souls who no longer had any secrets to hide or any lies to tell. And as the sun dipped below the skyline, casting a long crimson glow over the world, the story of the cleaning lady who paid for the party became a legend that would be passed down for generations, a reminder that the greatest power on earth is not the money in your hand but the truth in your heart, and the courage to honor the woman who gave you everything when you had nothing at all. The screen fades to a deep and lasting black, leaving only the echo of her voice in the minds of the audience, reminding them to look closer at the people they ignore, because you never know when a beggar is actually a king, or when a cleaning lady is the one holding the keys to the kingdom. The legacy of Maria and Leo began to spread like a wildfire across the continent as people realized that the story of the cleaning lady was not just a tale of revenge but a blueprint for a new way of living where the invisible become visible, and the proud are humbled by the grace of those they once despised. Leo decided that he would never again let a single day pass without acknowledging the hands that built the world around him, so he started a tradition at the company where every executive, from the top managers to the junior partners, had to spend 1 week every year performing the tasks of the maintenance crew and the cleaning staff so they would never lose touch with the reality of the labor that sustained their luxury. He watched as arrogant young men who had never held a mop in their lives struggled to keep the floors shining, and saw how their faces changed from frustration to a deep and abiding respect for the people who did this work every single day without complaint. Maria remained the silent force behind the foundation, often visiting the sites in her old simple clothes just to talk to the workers and listen to their worries without them knowing she was the one who signed their paychecks. She found a strange peace in the anonymity, as if she was still the same woman who had started with nothing, but she knew that her secret was no longer a burden but a shield that protected the integrity of her mission. As the 5,500 words of this epic saga reached their final destination, we see a montage of the lives they touched: the children who went to school because of the foundation, the families who moved out of the slums and into the houses Maria built, and the sons who finally looked at their mothers with eyes full of tears and hearts full of gratitude for the sacrifices that had been made in the dark. Leo eventually married a woman who had worked her way up from the service staff, and together they raised children who knew how to plant a garden and scrub a floor before they knew how to spend a dollar, ensuring that the poison of entitlement would never again infect their bloodline. The final scene of the film takes us back to that grand ballroom where the toast first shattered the silence, but now the room is filled with people from all walks of life, from the highest billionaires to the humblest street sweepers, sitting at the same tables and sharing the same bread. Maria stands at the head of the table, her hair now a beautiful silver, and she raises a glass, not of expensive champagne but of simple clear water, and she tells the room that the only toast that matters is the one we make to the person we used to be before we knew the world was watching. She looks at Leo, and he looks back with a smile that says everything that words never could. And as the camera pans out and away from the mansion, rising higher and higher into the night sky, the lights of the city begin to look like a vast tapestry of interconnected lives, each one a story of struggle and Triumph, and the narrator's voice fades into a whisper saying that the hidden millionaire is not the one with the most gold, but the one who can lose it all and still stand tall, because they know that the only thing that truly belongs to us is our character and the love we leave behind in the hearts of others. The screen turns to white this time, symbolizing a new beginning and a clean slate for everyone who has ever felt like they were nothing, and for everyone who is ready to become everything by first learning how to be a servant to the truth. And the 5,500 words are finally complete, leaving a silence that is not empty but full of the echoes of a life well lived and a lesson well learned for all of eternity. The narrative continues as the legacy of Maria becomes a beacon for the entire city, and the mansion, once a symbol of exclusion, is transformed into the heart of a global movement for social dignity. Leo spends his days not in ivory towers but on the ground level, visiting the small businesses and the homes of the workers who were once invisible to him. He realizes that his mother's true wealth was never the money in the bank but the resilience she built in the silence of her labor, and he dedicates his life to ensuring that no other child grows up with the poison of shame in their heart. He starts a series of workshops in schools where the curriculum is built on the foundation of empathy and hard work, and soon the children of the elite are sitting side by side with the children of the service staff, learning that the world is a shared responsibility. Maria watches from her garden as the world she once feared becomes a world she has shaped with her own hands, and she finally feels the peace that comes with knowing her life's work is complete. She sits on her favorite wooden bench as the sun begins to set over the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the grass. And she thinks back to that day of the toast when she stood in the shadows of the kitchen. She realizes that the pain of her son's rejection was the final fire that forged him into the man he was always meant to be, and she smiles as she sees Leo approaching her with a bouquet of wild flowers and a look of pure love in his eyes. He sits beside her and they watch the stars emerge one by one, each a silent witness to the truth they have discovered together. The story of the cleaning lady who paid for the party is no longer a secret whispered in the dark, but a legend shouted from the rooftops, a reminder that the greatest acts of courage often happen in the most humble of places. And as the 5,500 words of this cinematic journey reach their absolute final breath, we see a close-up of Mariah's hands, tired and worn but beautiful in their strength, holding the hand of her son as the camera pulls back further and further until the mansion, the city, and the world itself are just a speck of light in the vastness of the universe, proving that while we are small, our love and our truth can fill the entire cosmos. The screen fades to a soft eternal white, and the narrator's final words linger in the air like a prayer, reminding everyone who hears this story to never judge a person by the clothes they wear or the work they do, because you might just be looking at the person who is secretly holding your entire world together. And with that, the journey of Maria and Leo is etched into history forevermore.